Distinguished guests and participants, the competing teams for this year's awards. And my phone is ringing. Sorry about that. I won't answer it. Yes, there was occasion where somebody answered the phone and proceeded to have a conversation on stage. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to be here this evening and to take part in these final stages of your activities. I was quite uncertain why you would want to invite a retired governor of the South African Reserve Bank to be with you when you could easily have invited the ones who are still practicing the art of central banking. I thought maybe you were feeling sorry for a pensioner and you thought maybe we might offer a pensioner something to eat. It's one thing I promise you, that when we become a pensioner, things are a bit much more nicer than before. You get a pensioner's card, which allows you to buy at discounted prices on certain days at Pick and Pay, ShopRite, Checkers, and so on. And you learn to budget quite well. You actually know where the cheap goods are and on which day. So if there's one thing that the students should learn, is that should prepare for the days when you become a pensioner. But I must say, I also agreed to come here because I was bullied, actually, by the leadership of KPMG, Mr. Suleiman and company. They know themselves. Now, we know that the media writes on a regular basis about the financial crisis and the recession which we've just gone through. And indeed, if by now nobody is familiar with what the crisis has been, there will be something amiss. It is just over 2 years ago that we found ourselves in the crisis. I know in the business sector, discussions are quite intense and robust about what might have caused the crisis and how the authorities handled the crisis. Some economists, such as Professor Robini of the Robini Global Economics Institute, have become, as it were, crisis time prophets and heroes because of their permanent cynicism, which happened to coincide with the recession. There's nothing that Robini says that's positive, generally. So by the very basic law of nature, at some stage, his negative views were going to coincide with a historical occurrence. There's nothing special about that. And indeed, many egos have been challenged amongst economists throughout this period, and many indeed have been brought to Mother Earth because their economic analysis has been found wanting. Not least the so-called big economists at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. There is still no definitive agreement as to how we got ourselves to where we are today. Was it because monetary policy, interest rates, monetary policy was loose for too long around the world particularly in the developed countries? Was it because the housing market in the US had become too unsustainable with a huge concentration of risk in the subprime market? Was it because the bankers had forgotten what banking is all about, became too arrogant, greedy, exuberant to the extent that they lost contact with the real world and yet turned around to contaminate it? You remember, the students will remember this very well, that the bankers created mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, and in addition to that, created further CDOs called CDOs squared. I hope the students remember this. If I was to ask for a test, I'm sure they'll pass very well. Was it perhaps, as some would proclaim loudly from the rooftops these days, the lack of regulation or poor surveillance by the International Monetary Fund? Or still, was it because of the behavior of the rating agencies, who seem to write and publish what they like, sometimes far removed from the real world, more often than not forgetting the negative consequences of what they write? Whatever the answers to these questions, the reality is that we've been through a deep-seated financial and economic crisis. We all remember very well the dreaded day in September, I think September 15th, 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed. And there's no doubt in the minds of many people who follow financial and economic developments that September 15th, 2008 changed the world the way we knew it. The days that followed were probably the most demanding to date for any central banker or finance minister or bank regulator. In fact, most of us wished that we would have retired by that time so that we didn't have to go through those harrowing experiences. Be that as it may, the question might be asked whether we are today out of the woods or not. Well, to answer this question, we perhaps need to turn to those who should have sufficient global data before them to know better. I usually turn to the researchers at the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the OECD. But they too have been found wanting. But the reason why I turn to them on a regular basis is because they have the largest concentration of global data. They should be able to do proper analysis. It's like if you really want some authoritative data analysis in South Africa, you turn to the South African Reserve Bank because they have the concentration of researchers with the vast amount of economic data in South Africa. So the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD. Every April, the IMF produces a report called the World Economic Outlook. And that's followed in September by another one. These reports usually coincide with the April meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. That's not me. The April meetings of the IMF and World Bank Board of Governors. And this enables them to do some analysis of the global economy. According to the April issue, therefore, of the World Economic Outlook, it seems that the fears of a double-dip recession had been avoided. And based on the data that they had in April, they projected that the world economy was likely to grow by some 4.5% in 2011, which is quite encouraging, with the emerging market economies likely to grow by some 6.5%, and the developed market economies by some 2.5%. And this, by any standard, is a fairly optimistic view of the likely developments in the world economy. More often than not, I prefer to hang on to the positives than the negatives of Robin and others. Inflation fears are fairly subdued, although in the language of central bankers, vigilance must be the order of the day because of pressures from food and oil prices. In April, central banks were urged not to start tightening monetary policy too early, and the fiscal authorities were urged not to withdraw the fiscal stimuli that had been provided. Indeed, this has been the case in most countries except maybe for Australia, Sweden, and recently China. However, the mantra of central banking and fiscal authorities holds. Stay vigilant against inflation threats and prepare for fiscal consolidation because there are too many vulnerabilities at play. For the students, not for the older people, for the students, if you could remember this, whenever you hear a central banker speak, watch out for the words they use. Vigilant, inflation threat, we stand ready to do whatever is necessary. That's standard. You must remember that. If you can remember that, you're going to become good central bankers. As we were beginning to think that maybe the West was over, the European sovereign debt crisis has hit us. And this crisis, if not properly handled, might lead us into another September 15th, 2008 moment. Spreads have widened in Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, the so-called PIGS countries. There are serious concerns in the markets about whether Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy will be able to service their debt. Greek debt, as we know, is currently estimated at around 350 billion euros. And is growing by the day, depending on whether a solution to the crisis has been found or not. Again, for the benefit of the students, the debt is growing because for every day that goes by without paying for that debt, the mountain is climbing. And for every day that there's a squabble amongst the authorities about how better to handle the debt or not, the spread is widening. In other words, the rate of increase in the interest burden is increasing. So the quicker those folks sort out the problems, the better for all of us. It is estimated that Greek debt will peak at around 161% of GDP in 2012. Now, of course, many people have been debating about how did the Greeks get themselves into this situation. One of the two most important lessons from the Greek situation is that, one, a country needs to have a proper fiscal policy framework. At the root of that is that you must collect tax and have responsible spending and maintain the basic long-held economic views. Try to be conservative on the economy, and you can shout as much political slogans as you want.